So if you caught my tutorial last week, I was talking about histograms and why you should use them. And if you remember that picture that I had where the blinkies were happening in the sky in the foreground, and I said, don't worry about the blinkies, trust your histogram, don't trust the back of your camera. So I'm going to show you that picture that we were working on in that video and show you how I went through and developed it in about 5 minutes or less. Alright, so here we are in Lightroom, and I wanted to show you a couple of things before we start. So first things first, before I ever get working on my images, I always hit the letter J. What the letter J does is enable both your highlight clipping and your shadow clipping. You can see that by the red in the highlights and the blue in the shadows. Alright, so we've got 6 sliders that we're going to talk about here under the tone section, and then I'm going to slip down here to the present section. Alright, so first things first, the tone section is essentially what it sounds like, tones, light and dark. We call that luminosity. So if you remember back from the prior video that I did, I had the blinkies happening up here in the sky and down here in the water. And I said, don't worry about it. As long as your exposure is proper, you can fix that here in Lightroom. So before I fix that, let me just show you one quick thing that I do when I bring my images in. I take the exposure slider all the way to the left, and then I take it all the way to the right. Now let me just hit J. I'm going to turn off these clippings for a second here. But you see, if I'm all the way to the right, I can see what shadow detail I have in the image, and I go all the way to the left, I can see all my highlight details. So looking at this image, I have all my highlight details that I want, all my shadow details that I want, so I'm good to go with this particular image. Okay, so I'm going to give this image a bit of exposure. We're going to go up to about plus 25, which is about 1/4 of a stop of light. And then I'm not going to touch the contrast until I go through my highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, and then I'll come back to that. So first things first, hit the letter J. I'm going to take my highlights all the way to the left to prove to you that they are there. So you can see that pretty much everything in the water and in the sky is there. So it looks a little bit muddy though. I want to bring this back up to a little bit more natural feel, right about there. And then I'm going to take my shadows and do the same thing. I'll increase them by moving to the right. And as I move up to the right, you can see that I've got a lot of detail there, but I do want to pull that back just a little bit, just to leave myself some natural blacks. Okay. Now on the whites and the blacks, basically you're trying to set yourself a nice pure white point and a nice pure black point. That will help in the overall contrast of the scene. So here's a trick for you. Hold your Option key, or Alt if you're on a PC, and drag the slider until you see a little bit of that highlight appear. As soon as you see the pixels starting to blow out like that, that's indicating that those particular pixels are pure white. So I'm going to just bring this back again right to about there. I've set my white point. I'm going to do the exact same thing for the blacks. So again, I'm going to hold my Option key and I'm going to move that slider around, and anywhere that you see black pixels popping up, those are pure black, so that's my black point. So I'm going to move them in a little bit. I don't mind if I get some shadow clipping in some of those really deep inset rocks. So we'll come back to the little bit of highlight clipping that we have here, and the same with the shadows, and I'll show you how to really pinpoint and finesse this area without affecting the rest of the scene. So for now, we're going to hit the letter J, turn that off. I'm going to come down here to my clarity slider. Now clarity, you have to understand that it is just mid-tone contrast adjustment. It's got nothing to do with sharpening. It gives you the illusion that it's sharp, but it really doesn't sharpen your image. So we're going to move our slider to the right if we want to increase the look of sharpening. We're going to move it to the left if we want that soft look. So for my landscapes, I prefer to go anywhere from plus 20 to plus 25. Okay, so we'll just go to plus 20 for this particular one so you can see what this does to the image. So you may notice this dehaze slider and you're looking at your computer going, I don't have that there. Well, if you didn't upgrade or update your Lightroom in the last week or so, you may not have this in there. So when you update to the latest version, which is 7.3, and that's Adobe Lightroom Classic CC, you'll notice that they moved the dehaze slider from down here under the effects panel all the way up here under the clarity, and I think that's a perfect spot for it because it kind of goes hand in hand. So what the dehaze slider is going to do is allow me to get rid of that bit of haze that's going on in the image. So watch what happens when I move this up to the right. You see that little bit of haze that's happening in the water and in the background trees? I'm going to move this ever so slightly, say it about the same as my clarity, and you'll notice that it got rid of some of that haze down here in my water and also right here in the midtones in the trees. Okay, so once I've worked with those two, I'm going to bounce back up here to my contrast because I'm going to see if I need any more contrast in the image. So let me just take the slider to the right, back to the left, back to the right, back to the left, and I think it actually looks good between +5 and +10. It's given just a little bit more richness, but you'll notice if I hit the letter J again that I still have a little bit of clipping going on in the image, and again, we'll fix that in a few minutes. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the color itself in the image. Right now it's looking a little bit blah. I'm going to show you 3 tricks to bring this up but still make it look natural. So step number 1 is to go up here where it says Profile, and again, this is new to this version 7.3 of Lightroom. This was not here before. It was way down at the bottom under calibration. So this is great that it's right at the top here. All right, so you'll notice that it's set to Adobe Standard. So I'm going to change this to Adobe Landscape and watch the colors automatically pop when I do this profile adjustment. You see how they come back and they look a little bit more natural? Now I do want to enhance what's already here, and I do this with all my images. I don't add color to my scenes at all. I don't go in and paint different colors and purples and pinks and so on. I just take what's already in the scene, what I've captured, and then I increase the vibrance and the saturation to pull some of that color out. So if you don't know the difference between vibrance and saturation, vibrance basically takes colors that are desaturated and brings them up before touching colors that are already saturated. Whereas taking the saturation slider up or down increases every single color at the same time or decreases every single color at the same time. So it's a good finishing touch, but you really got to be careful when you're working with saturation. We're going to take this vibrance slider up towards the right, increase some of that saturation, pull out the colors that are already in the scene there, and then I'm going to finish off by pulling up the saturation and watching my screen, hoping that I don't get to the point where it looks too fake. Okay, now I want to see what it looks like before and after. So the very first step when I brought it in until now. And a little keyboard shortcut that you can use is your backslash key. So we're going to hit backslash. That shows you before, and you'll notice up here in the top right area, it says before. All right, and then I hit backslash again, and now we see after. So you can see how much we changed just by moving 6 sliders in the tone area, and then these 4 sliders down here, as well as the profile. So everything was done in this section, and you can see the change just by doing that. I haven't done anything else. I've not exited this program, haven't added any special magical touches. It's just the fact that I'm pulling out that detail that was initially in my camera. Okay, so next section we're going to go down to is lens corrections. Is there any vignetting going on in the image, which is just darkening of the corners, or is there any distortion going on from using a wide angle lens? When I was shooting with this lens, I was using a Sony FE 16-35 f2.8, that's the G Master lens, and I was at 17 millimeters. So I'm at the wide end, and I may have a little bit of distortion going on. So I'm going to see what happens when I click on this Enable Profile Corrections. So you'll notice that the actual image itself didn't have a lot of distortion, which is really nice to see, but you do see that the corners were quite dark. So my job as a landscape photographer is to keep the people looking at the image interested in the scene. If you have bright corners, which luckily this picture doesn't, but if you had a picture that had bright corners, people's eye will tend to drift off the page, and you don't want that. You want to keep them kind of circling in the image. Now that's got a lot to do with composition, but you also have to watch the tones in the corners. So I find that Lightroom takes their corners when they add that vignetting correction, and they actually overdo it. So what I would suggest is once you've got the correction done, you take your vignetting and you move it back towards the left about halfway. And what that's going to do is reintroduce some of the vignetting, but not bring all of it back. And so we've got nice, natural, dark vignetting going on in the corners, and it just draws you into the scene without you actually noticing that the corners are dark. Okay, so we've got 2 other things that we want to do. First thing we're going to take a look at is the detail. And in this, I'm not going to over sharpen it, but I do want to pull out some of those details. So when you sharpen, you're going to notice that it has this little warning symbol that pops up. And what that's trying to tell you is that you need to be zoomed in to 100% in order to sharpen correctly. So I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to take this section here because it's got some nice details in the rocks and the moss and so on. And we're going to sharpen this, and we're going to watch the screen and make sure that we don't overdo it. So to keep this very simple, I would suggest that you just keep your radius between 1 and 1.5, And don't touch the detail or the masking for now, okay? All I really suggest you do is you take your amount up between 50 and 75 and see what your image looks like from there, all right? So we're gonna take this up to plus 50. Give it a second to kick in. Right, now I'm gonna show you what it looked like before, and now I'm gonna show you what it looks like after. And those details are great. Those pop really, really nice. And as I scroll around the scene and then let this kick in, I don't really see any crispiness going on. And what I'm looking for in crispiness is any pixels that look like they've been over sharpened. All right, so I got one more adjustment that I want to do, but I forgot to tell you about the chromatic aberration. Chromatic aberration is like a purple kind of red fringing that you see in high contrast areas. So if you look here, it looks to be like there's red or purple on some of my branches. That is actually an illusion in this image because when I zoom in, it will disappear. You see how it's gone? However, if you notice that when you zoom in and you still see this weird aberration or fringing going on around these high contrast areas, you can go back under your lens correction, and where it says enable profile corrections, you'll notice that there's a remove chromatic aberration directly above it. So just go ahead and check that. And without getting into further details, I would say that automatically will look for the purple fringing and we'll try to eliminate it. Now you can go in and manually update it, but that will be for a future video. Okay, so our very last thing that we're gonna do to the image here is re-enable the highlight and shadow clipping by hitting J. And then I'm gonna go up here to my adjustment brush and I will click on the adjustment brush. And this brush is so cool because you can do localized adjustments. So instead of doing a global adjustment, which affects the entire image, we can go in here and we can just paint in certain areas that we want to fix. So in this case, what I'm going to do is concentrate on the highlights in this image. So over here, where it says custom, I'm going to hit the drop down menu, I'm going to go to highlights, and I'm going to take that highlight slider, and at this point it really doesn't matter what you put in because you can tweak this after. So I'm just going to guess minus 36. And I'm going to come over here using my bracket keys on my keyboard. These are your square bracket keys beside the letter P on your keyboard. And I will hit the left bracket key to downsize this and paint this area in. And just like that, you've eliminated any of those areas that were still blown out where they had no details. All right, now if I decided that that went too far or not far enough, I could just come over here and I can take the highlights down, or I can take them up. Just like so. All right, so you basically give yourself a starting point and then you just go in here and you tweak it accordingly until you get rid of that highlight clipping. Now instead of painting on the shadows and trying to adjust it on the same brush, I can go in here and just click on this new button and I can choose to play with my blacks. All right, so I'm going to set my blacks to plus 10 as a guess. Again, this doesn't really matter exactly if you're right or wrong because you can correct this after the fact. And then I'm just going to paint over some of these areas. Now I'm okay with having pure black areas in the image because there are pure black areas in nature like this if you've got really, really deep inset shadows as we've got here. But I'm just going to paint over these really quick and eliminate most of them. And you'll notice that it's not really lightening the scene enough that you're going to see it. It's just pulling out that pure black and making it so that it's not completely clipped. Okay, so there you have it. I'm going to get out of this brush. Let's go into full screen mode here, just so you can see the overall picture. There's our final result. This is before, this is after. Before, after. Okay guys, so I hope you found that helpful. Try it on your own images and let me know in the comments below what you think.